Thank you, Dean Rutherford, and also to Chairman Susky. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I want to commend certainly Chairman Susky for having this sustainability docket and for inviting a diverse set of speakers with a diverse point of view. I think it's very important that you hear all sides of this issue. For me, the most important sustainability issue that we face globally and here in Arkansas is climate change. Not surprisingly, that's what I will talk about today. Many of you probably know, or you've heard, that I am an advocate for congressional action with regard to climate change. Some people would say an outspoken advocate. Some people would say a very opinionated advocate with regard to that. As is the case with much of the public discourse that takes place in this country today, there seems to be two diametrically opposing worldviews with regard to climate change also. Each has its own sound bites, each has its own flaws, and neither of which provides the basis for a sound public policy with regard to climate change. The first we hear a lot about from industry, from my own industry, for example, and that is just say no. To me, that's a horror story. It will not end well for anybody. The most understandable version of that is certainly the argument that now in the middle of the Great Depression is the worst time possible to load more costs on the economy. We simply can't afford it. The other opinion is what I call the fairy tale view, that addressing climate change will be economically painless. As an aside, there is another less responsible point of view that purports that CO2 is not a pollutant at all, but a nutrient. And regulating a nutrient would be like taking the food out of our own mouths. Everyone knows that CO2 is a nutrient, so the science must be purposely distorted or misled, or be misled in some kind of way for some reason which none of us have figured out yet. I didn't plan to talk much about that, but given the events of the last few weeks, the controversy around the emails from climate scientists at one university in the UK, some of you may wonder whether or not that's affected our point of view or not. The short answer is it hasn't. The scientific evidence that we are altering the climate goes well beyond the data sets and the models that are implicated in those emails that are currently being studied. The basis for public policy action is absolutely incontrovertible. I'll address this issue later, and I'll be happy to talk more about the email controversy to the extent that I have some knowledge of why it hasn't affected our point of view, certainly. But in my view, there is no longer any credible argument against the science with regard to climate change. And it's tragic that the climate change science has got caught up in the cynicism and the culture wars that exist in this country today. Recent emails disclosures notwithstanding, the science shows us that we face a real risk, a very real risk, of a catastrophic outcome within our children's lives and most certainly within our grandchildren's lives. That's a risk of a catastrophe, not a certainty. Any credible source would agree that the science does not prove with 99.44% confidence that we will have a catastrophe or various catastrophes. That is not the point. The science does demonstrate, without question, that we face a non-trivial probability of a catastrophe within our children or our grandchildren's lives. And that is more than enough basis to establish a sound public policy. Like most things, climate change is not about certainty. It's about risk, it's about probabilities, and it's about expected outcomes. As a businessman and as a CEO, I know that any company that ignores the material risk of a catastrophic outcome does not stay in business very long. In fact, you don't stay out of jail very long under some of the recent rules passed by Congress. Eventually, the odds will get you. That is risk management 101. It applies to business leaders and it applies to political leaders. Not the jail thing, only the business leaders get that one. The risks are simply too big to ignore. The most recent evidence is, of course, that we have underestimated the risks. And that should not be surprising to anybody at all, because what we are dealing with is scientists who are looking for absolutes in a world where there are very few absolutes. And it is a very long process of weeding out all other possible variables to get to an answer. So it's not surprising that the actual, what we're seeing to occur in the environment is lagging what the scientists' projections are. But let's get back to the economic arguments for a minute. The first of which is dealing with climate change right now is a luxury we can't afford. With unemployment as high as it is, with the economy struggling, we need to make hard choices, and climate change just doesn't make the cut. In this view now, it's the absolute wrong time, again, to add cost to the economy. I wish I shared that view, that we had the luxury of taking a wait-and-see approach. But in business, given where we are today, they call that the tyranny of the urgent. Sacrificing your future, mortgaging your future for what is most immediate right now, just to get through the day or get through the month or get through this year. The tyranny of the urgent is what we'd be guilty of. As I mentioned, that option is becoming somewhat moot because we're already starting to see the early effects of climate change. And in fact, while public opinion seems to be moving in one direction, away from a sense of urgency with regard to climate change, the science is moving exactly in the opposite direction, with more and more indicators that climate change is upon us. If you read the most recent science, such as the UN report that was issued, update that was issued in October of 2009, you'll find CO2 emissions, sea level rise, and global warming are all exceeding the predictions that were made just a couple years ago. Just a couple weeks ago, I was in a meeting with two of the leading scientists in the world. They're both American scientists on Arctic ice melt. And the discussion was around Greenland and sea level rise due to ice melt in Greenland. And what we heard from them is that the land ice melt was falling into the ocean much quicker than what had earlier been projected. And this was based upon direct observations, measurements that they were taking, not based upon any kind of models. But keep in mind that Greenland is no Las Vegas. You probably knew that. But it's no Las Vegas in a whole lot of more important ways. And what they say is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in Greenland doesn't stay in Greenland. It affects most of the world. In this particular case, we're talking about 1 meter of sea level rise that could affect potentially up to 1 billion people. The risk of species extinction is also increasing. Every month we get new data with regard to that. Last month, a new study showed that whole forests of aspens are being eliminated right here in the United States. What this means, of course, is doing nothing has a real cost attached to it. We have to stop thinking about action on climate change as a cost and start thinking about it as an investment. The investment that would avoid massive disruptions in our climate and potentially catastrophic outcomes and irreversible outcomes, which is absolutely critical way to think about this. Some of the things that are happening could be irreversible. Once the species is gone, it's gone. Like somebody once said, try pollinating by hand once the bees and other creatures are gone. If you think sea level rise is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily affect Arkansas, think about America's energy infrastructure. It's on the Gulf Coast and it's at significant risk. Almost half of America's oil and gas production occurs or passes through southern Louisiana. The refinery and the petrochemical industries, of course, are located on the Texas and the Louisiana Gulf Coast. The big four hurricanes of 2005 and 2008 are estimated to have cost society around $80 billion just due to the supply disruptions that occurred during those four storms. Now, we're not saying that those storms were caused by climate change, but they are harbingers of what we will see from climate change, but not on a temporary basis, certainly on a more frequent basis than what we've seen in the past. So at a minimum, sea level rise and greater storm intensity are going to have a direct impact on the energy costs in Arkansas. What about Arkansas's largest industry? Agriculture. In a recent survey by the Institute for Public Integrity, they surveyed economists who are considered experts on climate change on both sides of the issues who have been published, have been peer reviewed, and they asked, and 86% of the economists that were surveyed said agriculture would be the most negatively affected industry in this country from climate change. 86, it's hard to get two economists to agree on anything. 86% said agriculture would be the most heavily affected. When you hear people say now is not the right time, you should ask when is the right time and what is the alternative. Candidly, now isn't the best time. We're long past when the best time was, whenever that was. It was years ago, but we are where we are. And doing nothing at this late date is simply irresponsible. We're playing Russian roulette with the planet and our economy. The difference is there's a bullet in every chamber except one, and that's probably being generous with regard to the odds. Focusing on sea level for a moment, a major international insurance company, Alliance, released a study last month that said sea level rise of 0.5 meters. And again, the Greenland people already told us they're up to 1 meter. The insurance company said 0.5 meter by 2050 could put hundreds of millions of people at risk and trillions of dollars of assets. But that's somebody else's problem, right? Proverbs says that a good man leaves something for his children's children. I don't think this is what we want history or our grandchildren to remember us for what we left them. That brings us to the other argument, that dealing with climate change will not be difficult economically, that the solutions are not that costly. Yes, there will be some reductions that are relatively simple, but getting deep cuts in emissions will not be painless at all. Energy costs are going to go up. I assure you of that. If we do it right, though, we can minimize the cost impacts on families. But anybody who says that it will be cheap is either guilty of wishful thinking or they're uninformed about the real cost of getting deep cuts in emissions across the world in this country. In this country, over 80% of the emissions of CO2 in the electric sector come from coal plants. We have coal plants obviously here in Arkansas, Energy does, SWEPCO does, co-ops do. Anyone who owns a coal plant knows there are certain basic fundamentals attached to that coal plant. Once you build the plant, most of the life cycle costs of that plant are already sunk, they're spent. So the to-go costs are relatively small relative to building another plant to replace it. Properly maintained, a coal plant can last 50 to 60, 70 years or more, and some have. This means that it would be very, very expensive to reduce CO2 emissions by shutting down existing coal plants. And you get the same answer whether you replace those plants with renewables, wind or solar, or with nuclear. The economics are about the same as this chart over here shows between the cost of continuing to run an existing plant, about $100 megawatt hour difference of the cost to continue to run an existing plant that emits CO2 and replace it with something that doesn't emit CO2 like renewables or like nuclear. I should point out that a recent cover story here, and I brought the magazine in case you didn't see it. You probably saw it. It's a highly credible source. And in this magazine, the cover story is how you can get all your energy from wind, water, and solar power by 2030 from a very credible source. And what Scientific American did in the process of coming to that conclusion, as you see on the right-hand side here, they priced out wind at $55 a megawatt hour. And you can see right next to it, the real cost of wind is more like $150 a megawatt hour. That is absolutely pure fantasy, published in a very credible journal, the thought that you could get wind from $150 to $55 during this time. I know have absolutely no technological advance that could come anywhere near that area. Solar, you know, it's still coming down the cost curve, but that is the type of fantasy that we're talking about. What the real numbers mean, of course, is the cost of society if we force existing coal plants to shut down is going to be well over $100 a megawatt hour, $100, which is basically equivalent to $100 a ton of CO2 avoided, far above the prices that anybody is talking about in terms of dealing with climate change. The economic reality is that any strategy that relies upon replacing our existing coal plants is economically and politically doomed to fail. At the same time, the societal cost and the risk to the climate of not reducing CO2 is also one that we'll live to regret. So where does that leave us? As we tried to answer that question, we struggled. And instead we ask another question. Why can't we just keep what we have and fix it up in some kind of way that it doesn't do the damage to the environment that it does today? We turned to MIT to evaluate the feasibility of putting a CO2 scrubber on the back end of these existing plants. Now that is different than the various technologies you hear so much about today that take the carbon out on the front end of the combustion process, like coal gasification, for example. Then those technologies would be a total rebuild or replacement of these existing plants. So this is taking the existing plant and just putting a scrubber on the back end. The MIT report was released last spring. It's been a tremendous amount of study, involved a whole lot of people from inside and outside MIT. And it says that the technology does exist, that you could put a scrubber on the back end of these plants. The problem is we're not investing enough money in research and development to push it down the cost curve to make it really feasible or attractive to utilities to do that. But even if we improve the technology, I don't want to represent that this is going to be cheap. But in the long run, we believe it will be far cheaper than shutting the plants down and replacing them completely with something else. Importantly, this technology is applicable to the coal fleet that exists around the world. There's about 2 million megawatts of this same technology all around the world. And the plants around the world are newer than ours. They have a longer life left, and they're continuing to be built every single day. With this technology, the rest of the world can keep existing plants open, and it would be economic for them to clean them up. And in the absence of this, there is just literally no chance that countries like China are going to shut down brand new plants that they just built. Simply put, we just can't solve the climate change problem without carbon capture and sequestration technology. Washington has simply been answering the wrong question all along. They've been answering the question of what plants come next after this generation, and they should have been answering the question of what can we do with these plants that are going to remain in service for maybe 30 or 40 years left, and how is the rest of the world going to deal with this? This technology will solve our problem and the rest of the world's problem. We believe the only alternative is to get started now. We support an economy-wide, market-based approach with the price collar high enough to provide incentives and encourage new technologies, with protection for families, with an emphasis on technologies that work for the U.S. and around the world. We would add to all of that a pledge and review structure so that the United States would take the lead, as we should take the lead, but we don't continue down this path forever. If the rest of the world don't join us, then there would be a kind of a fail-safe provision in there that would halt our reductions. We would encourage the states to focus on protecting low and moderate income households. If utilities receive allowances to protect customers, let's make sure those allowances go to protect our most vulnerable customers. We encourage the states to incent energy efficiency and progressive regulatory structures that align the economic interests of the customers with those of the shareholders of the companies involved. We encourage the states to avoid local mandates. If the federal government adopts a market-based system, then encourage the utilities to let the market work. Encourage them to find the best overall solution that meets the specific customer needs in Arkansas, for example, which may well be different than a California or a New York or a Florida or someplace else. Recently, the phrase cap and trade has become a lightning rod, and worse, it's been used as an excuse for not passing climate change legislation. First, and you all know this here at the Clinton School, there are generally 3 policy options for dealing with an environmental externality like this. You can tax, cap and trade, or command and control, or specific limits at any one plant. The first 2 options put a price on the emission of CO2. That can be done through a tax, which the legislature would set, or through cap and trade, which the market would set. Either way is far superior to the third approach. Mandatory reductions on a plant-by-plant basis are also known as command and control. That would be a very, very expensive way to deal with CO2. For example, the Congressional Budget Office did a study and determined that under the Waxman-Markey bill, just by allowing offsets as part of the trading mechanism, it would reduce the clearing price for emission allowances by 69%. And that's just one particular available option when you have a trading mechanism to use rather than command and control. And by the way, as you all know, certainly by now, if Congress does not act, EPA will, and they will use command and control. In fact, they've already fired the first shot with an endangerment finding for CO2 this week. In some respects, they didn't have a whole lot of choice. In 1970, the Clean Air Act included CO2 as a pollutant. In Massachusetts versus the EPA, just a couple years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court found that EPA needed to complete their study on the dangers of CO2, and they hadn't done that. They just recently completed the study, and they came out with their endangerment finding, and then we expect regulations to start sometime next year. For some reason, though, there are some that view cap and trade as not a market-based mechanism, that is a violation of free market principles. I suppose that view comes from the fact that under the current bill, free allowances are given out to certain parties affected by the regulations. Those who oppose it on free market principles, though, are ignoring the fact, the larger issue, the CO2 emissions do have a cost that is presently internalized. And the only way to get it recognized in the marketplace is through some kind of legislation that forces the market to recognize it. Without a price on carbon, we're going to continue to overconsume certain resources, and free riders will push the cost or the damage to the environment off to somebody else. In this particular case, it's probably another generation. Our real choices, if we're concerned about doing this in a cost-effective manner, are doing it by a market-based mechanism. That's either a CO2 emissions tax or through cap and trade. Any mandates, such as for renewables, would fall under command and control. And mandates distort the market. They distort the incentives for research, development, and demonstration, and they will lead to overall higher compliance costs in the long run. When you hear criticisms of cap and trade, your first question should again be, what are they proposing instead? If they are proposing plant-specific emission limits, then I personally suspect they're selling something that will replace that plant. If they're sincerely proposing a tax, we could have an honest debate about the merits of cap and trade versus a tax. We've had that debate for years now, particularly about the efficiency of each and the effectiveness of each. But keep in mind, if they say that they are supporting the tax, one of the sharpest criticisms that's levied against cap and trade is that it is a hidden tax. And most people believe a tax is dead on arrival. So that's what you hear on your television ads. But more often than not, critics of cap and trade are not proposing anything else at all. What that means is they're proposing that we do nothing. But that is politically incorrect for most industries to say they're proposing doing nothing. Companies are getting great pressure from their shareholders to disclose their CO2 emissions and to do something about them. They're finding it increasingly difficult to their own investors to say we're against doing anything with regard to climate change or CO2. So instead, they attack the mechanism. In this particular case, it's cap and trade. And they use third-party mouthpieces to do it, so there's no real fingerprints with regard to that. In many circles and TV ads that you've probably seen, you hear this called the cap and trade bill. This is not about cap and trade. This is about energy security, it's about energy independence, and it's about creating a more sustainable environment. But that doesn't make for very good sound bites to say you're against those things. So instead, we're against cap and trade. However, there are some legitimate concerns about cap and trade and how it is being proposed in these bills that needs to be thought through. First of all, in the absence of a strong price protection There's the possibility that allowance prices could get so high as to create economic mayhem, at least for a temporary period of time until the market settles out. We agree that cost control provisions need to be strengthened in this bill, and we think a price collar would be the way to do it. The second concern is continuing down the path of emission reductions. If the rest of the world doesn't join us at some point, just doesn't make any sense. We agree that we would be economically disadvantaging America under that scenario. We would simply be moving greenhouse gases offshore, along with our industries, along with our jobs. And the risk of climate change, of course, would barely change at all. The U.S. absolutely has to lead. But at some point, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years down the road, if the developing nations are not engaged, then leadership becomes unilateralism. We would use the price cap to better address this issue. So at some point, again, say 10 years from now, we would continue to escalate the price cap only if some percentage of the developing nations or the world emitters are also following suit with regard to what the United States is doing. For example, we could just print more allowances at a fixed price until we had more of the world signed up for exactly the same type of things that we were committed to. That protects our economy, and it provides an incentive for other nations to sign up for the same limits that we are signed up for. But neither of these concerns, while significant, are disqualifying. What we should be thinking about is how to improve cap and trade, not why we should throw it out. Some say we are not the problem, that the growth in CO2 emissions around the world is coming from the developing nations, not from the U.S. Well, first of all, greenhouse gases linger in the atmosphere, as all of you know, for decades, and portions of it for centuries. The stuff that is up in the atmosphere today was put there by the developed nations, particularly by the United States, not by the developing nations around the world. The stuff up there is ours. We're responsible for it. Secondly, our emissions on a per capita basis are still far above those in the developing world. Under the Waxman-Markey bill, U.S. emissions on a per capita basis are projected to drop from 25 tons per person to about 15 tons per person. Under China's plan, not their commitment, but their plan, their emissions would be around 7 to 8 tons per person, or about half of what ours would be in 2020. I think, for lack of a better word, it would be un-American for us to say, we got ours, but you can't have yours. Meaning that we have a certain lifestyle, but you can't have the same opportunity to achieve that lifestyle in your country because we just got here before you did. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, we cannot solve this problem unless the developing countries do come along. We need to design all of our policies with regard to that issue. We need to bring them along, and a pledge and review system is certainly one of the things that need to be included in this bill to encourage them to come along. But we can't just say no, and I assure you we can't just muscle them either. Some say cap and trade is a ploy by Wall Street, and it's prone to Enron type abuse. But cap and trade has been used before, of course, with SO2 without any abuse at all. In any event, a price collar provision would drastically reduce any incentive anybody would have to play games with the market or with these allowances. If you're concerned about Wall Street getting their hands on these allowances, think about a tax. And think about the federal government taking all the allowance revenues and putting them into the general fund and spending it on something else. Without recycling the revenues into the economy, this would become one of the most costly and regressive programs ever to come out of Washington. Some say electricity is getting a free ride because they're getting some free allowances in this bill. We did, as a company, we didn't support free allocations to anybody, and not the electric sector in particular. We favored a cap and an auction and recycling of the revenues back into the economy, in particular to those hardest hit, the households. But the way the bill is structured, allocating allowances to regulate, the key is regulated utilities. To regulated utilities mitigate the impact on customer bills and is another way to protect households. Regulators, such as the Arkansas Commission, have all the power in the world to assure that those allowances do go to reduce customer bills and not to the utilities for profits or windfalls. Neither the bill that passed the House nor the bill that passed the Senate are certainly perfect from our perspective. But again, there is no such thing as a perfect bill. Nobody's ever seen a perfect bill. And this is not, time is not our ally in trying to design the first perfect bill to ever come out of Congress. But this is definitely a huge step in the right direction. As a company, we strongly believe we do need a hard price cap. We also need to put a pledge and review mechanism in this bill. And if we could recycle more of the allowance revenues back to households sooner than is proposed, that would be a good thing also. You should be skeptical of claims or insinuations that these bills will be an economic disaster. Point in fact, you have an ad running right now on television in Little Rock. You probably have all seen it. It says that the U.S. Treasury study shows that cap and trade, again, the reference is to cap and trade, will cost $200 billion a year. That implies about $7,000 per household. First of all, $200 billion is a reference to a global cost, not a domestic cost, a global cost. And secondly, more importantly, it's based upon a bill or legislation or a plan that doesn't exist. It never existed. It was a hypothetical study done that basically says what would happen if the whole world developed a carbon tax at a certain level and every nation kept the money themselves and didn't recycle anything back into the economy. What would be the cost to every citizen on the face of the planet? $200 billion. Well, the implications are it's only for the U.S., and that is the bill, and you divide it out, it gets to be $7,000 a household. The truth is the Congressional Budget Office prices the Waxman-Markey bill at $175 per household per year. The EPA prices it at $120 a year per household. A far cry from the implications of $7,000, which is what you're hearing in your TV ads. On the other hand, defense spending, for example, does cost every American household around $6,000 a year. I don't think anybody would disagree that that is an excellent investment. We all want a strong defense. We need a strong defense. For the same basic reasons that we need a strong military to protect us, we need a strong climate bill to protect us against the potential catastrophic outcomes that come from climate change. Here in Arkansas, we expect the effects of a climate change bill to be relatively modest. In part, that's because at Entergy Arkansas, for example, our emissions are 46% below the, for CO2 below the national average. And interestingly enough, most of the cost under the Waxman-Markey bill that we're projecting is for the renewable portfolio mandate. Our current projections are that under this bill, electric rates would rise about 1% a year from 2012 to 2021. And about 70% of that increase in price comes from the renewable portfolio standard. That is why, in my opinion, this is not the best way to do this with the technology mandate. If we put a price on carbon through a cap and trade, then things like renewables that are economic, without a mandate, that are economic, will get built, and we will have used our money wisely. The world is looking to the U.S., and I'm sure you're well aware of that with Copenhagen this week. The world is looking for the U.S. to lead in the climate change effort. We need to start by passing domestic legislation now. I'm not naive that this will be easy, that it will occur overnight. It certainly hasn't occurred overnight. Someone once said that we can't deny the cynicism or the callousness of which humans are capable. And I suspect we haven't seen anything yet. It will be a tough, ugly fight, as evidenced by that extremely insulting TV ad that I just referenced. The Society of Professional Journalists states that public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. Any efforts to deliberately distort the public's knowledge, to confuse the public, are not just an attack on the climate bill, they're an attack on democracy itself. Without public enlightenment, an electorate that is armed with the truth, we have no more than the illusion of a democracy, no more than that. But some people refuse to be ashamed of themselves. Unlike the citizens of other nations, Americans have always been united less by a shared past than by shared dreams of a better future. We cannot deny this nation's history of courage and compassion that offers hope for the future. Cynicism or hope, courage or cowardice, action or talk. That's our choices. We're the first generation in history that has to answer the question of whether we're more important than future generations. I believe with all my heart that everybody involved in this, in their own heart, knows the answer to that question. But it requires all of us to support Congress and articulate what we are for instead of railing about what we are against. Horseman once said, "Be afraid to die until you have won some victory for humanity." This is the best chance you're ever going to get. And eternity is a long time to have regrets. I'll be glad to take any questions you have. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions, so would you please raise your hands, and then let's wait for the microphone to get here. We have one right over here, and I'll get you this microphone.
Hi, my name's Lev Gooder. I'm with the Sierra Club, and I appreciate you coming by and talking today. I had a question. Entergy Arkansas is asking from the ADEQ and the PSC approval of a $1 billion investment to prolong the life of the White Bluff coal-fired plant. Much of that $1 billion with a B, is going to be paid by Arkansas ratepayers. And none of that investment is going to go to reducing CO2 emissions. Given that Integra has already built a 2,200 megawatt natural gas plant, now that's only running at 25%, how does Entergy justify not making that switch? Thank you.
I'm sorry, the switch to?
To natural gas in the other already built facility. I understand that it's a possibility that it can just be switched to that, so I was just asking about the...
Economics. I mean, it's just pure, and the Commission certainly would always has a hand in trading off volatility of natural gas prices versus more certainty when you're dealing with a fuel like coal, for example. And then you deal with just the raw economics of it. In this particular case, it's important to keep in mind that under the cap and trade bill, that's the value of it. You can make an argument, well, shut the plant down, completely replace it with something else, but that doesn't change the overall emission level that Entergy would be responsible for, or the nation would be responsible for. It would just add costs. So you still have a cap that you have to stay under. And if putting a scrubber on that plant and then doing something else on the system someplace else or buying allowances is cheaper and keeping that plant open, that's the right answer. If switching it to natural gas, and you still have to buy allowances obviously there because that's about half the CO2 content, is the right answer. And buying allowances from somebody else or doing something else on the system, then you achieve the same outcomes. You're going to hit that cap regardless. That's what's going to happen. But you do it at a lower cost. So at this point in time, obviously, we don't have a bill where the Commission is looking at it and saying, well, gee, we have to factor in CO2 at this point. But the overall thought process certainly is we're going to comply with the law. We're going to comply with the cap. We're in favor of pushing that cap down, obviously, as low as is politically acceptable to do. And we want to do it in the most cost-effective manner possible. But one thing I will say is the technology for the CO2 scrubber today only works if you have the SO2 scrubber. So you need to take out those impurities before you can take out CO2.
Questions? We have a question right over here.
Mr. Leonard, Eric Britt. I am skeptical, as I think many others are, of the timing of this, and what I call is kind of like the corporate takeover of the green movement. We've known these things since the 70s. We've had nuclear power, we have electric cars. We know we weren't doing very good things in the past, but now we have to put it forward, and why now, and why do we need a bill to tell us to do the right thing when we know we should have been doing this earlier?
Yeah. Well, that's, that's an excellent question. President Bush proposed voluntary compliance. He asked industry to voluntarily reduce their CO2 emissions. We did. We were the only utility who did. We've been reducing ours since 2001. Our level of CO2 emissions is below 1990 levels now by about 20%. Nobody else followed us. We were kind of on our own. It's a very optimistic view, of business and of human nature that will do voluntary things to meet these kind of standards, as difficult as it is. The fact is capitalism works. The fact is price signals work. And if we're serious about getting this done, again, we believe we need to put a price on carbon to make it happen. And you're right. I mean, a lot of this, from a business standpoint, you could see this coming a long time ago. From a scientific standpoint, of course, like I said, they're dealing with absolutes. And it's interesting because you see these same scientists who 10 years ago were saying, I'm skeptical about climate change, and now they say, I'm a firm believer in climate change. They were always, if you ask them, what do you think is going to happen? They'll say, I think it's real. But they didn't pass through the test yet of eliminating all possible variables, so they stayed on the skeptical side for so long. And that's where public policy has just failed us. It's let science kind of lead and wait for that, and that's science on something like this, where you have an open system, will just never give us an answer in time. And it is unfortunate, because we find ourselves at a place now where, and this is what's different, about climate change, these tipping points. That once you cross over a certain line, then you're in free fall. And nobody knows what happens when that occurs. And so you have a nonlinear result. And that is not just difficult to model, but it's even if you could model it, it's scary, it's frightening. And so that's why now it's so important, because we're on a path that we can't stay within what's viewed as the tipping points.
Ms. Abrams has a question right here. Hold on, Annie, wait for the mic. Let Bob get you the mic.
As a social responsible corporation, which you've been recognized for, what can be done to help the most vulnerable, affected customers of the corporation help promote this change for their future family members, just as we are trying to overcome the digital divide of that most vulnerable citizenry?
That's kind of a sore point for me here in Arkansas. A few years ago, the legislature passed a bill in Arkansas that Entergy supported. The commission approved it also. It was a 1 mil adder to electricity that would provide a fund to insulate, weatherize the homes of our poor customers. Legislature approved it, commission approved it, governor didn't sign it, but he let it go through. We had a lawsuit against it and lost. Essentially, they said they didn't have the power to do that. I can't imagine how much good that program would have created in all these years if it hadn't got thrown out. We're not done with that effort yet. We still think that makes a lot of sense. Here in Arkansas, I think we have 11 programs right now for energy efficiency. We have various low-income programs, obviously, that we work. We have low-income summits where we work with all of our low-income advocates to help them write grants. A big piece of about half of our foundation money goes to low-income groups. Probably at least half of our lobbying in Washington goes to support low-income programs. It used to be 100% would go to support our nuclear lobbying efforts or something of that nature, and we've changed all that. I like to think that we're the best friend our low-income customers have. There are times it feels like we're the only friend that they have, but we could do more. We have low-income advocates internally that look at every policy we have, every decision we make, and they serve to critique it from our most vulnerable customers' perspective and how it impacts them.
Questions? Any additional questions? Right here, Representative Webb.
Thank you. Kathy Webb, State Representative. I really appreciate your coming today, and I spoke with you in Washington about a month or so ago. We've had mostly, from my perspective, views presented that are very contrary to what you said today. And for those of us who have been working on this issue, I would guess that you're probably familiar with what Claiborne Deming has been saying at the legislature and around the state. And could you give me some specifics that I could use to counter what he's been saying, bluntly?
Well, we start with Mr. Deming is an oil man, and we get in with that. He's an oil man. And so I think that his comments need to be taken in the context of he's an oil man that owns a lot of stock in an oil company, a family company. You know, there is, you know, obviously don't want to accuse Mr. Deming of this, but there is something called paradigm denial, and that occurs. And reading some of these comments, you know, certainly comes from the petroleum industry and from others, there seems to be this paradigm denial occurring. And some of the comments, you know, certainly that I've heard made just do not, they're not consistent with the facts in the bill. I mean, one of the things I think that irritates, seems to irritate Mr. Deming the most, is that the electric sector did get free allowances, some free allowances, and the petroleum industry did not, or got very little. The refineries got some, but very little. And, you know, that's a public policy decision that somebody makes. And we could all argue about why that might be true. But if we think about it, is it really create that kind of unfairness or inequity? Or is it really good policy? The objective here, in part, I think, as Congress looked at this, you know, was to get the emission reductions that they needed, but not hurt real people. Make it a better society as a result. Electricity, like it or not, is a necessity. When people can't afford it, when they can't use it, they die. People freeze to death, or they die in the summer from heat exhaustion. So it's a real threat to life when our most vulnerable customers can't afford the product. So by giving allowances to the utilities and making it contingent upon passing them on, the regulators will pass them on to lower the bills, they've made electricity more affordable for everybody in this country. They haven't made utilities better off, but they've made customers better off. It's a way of recycling it. On the other hand, what they appears to have done with regard to oil and petroleum is they've said, we're going to let the price determine this. By giving free allowances to the oil and petroleum business, then you don't change the price maybe necessarily. Now, if people, I think we may not like it, but we probably drive way too many miles compared to certainly other countries. Is it a bad thing if we drive less miles? Do people die? I mean, yeah, no, not really. Less people die because less people on the roads. Now again, the oil industry, Mr. Deming may not like that price elasticity of the price will go up and people will drive less. But the reality is maybe we'll have a better society. Maybe people will use more mass transportation. Maybe less people will be killed on the roads. You might not like the fact you pay more at the pump and it's a little inconvenient. But when you're making that trade-off and you're going to give out so many free allowances, where do you want to give them? And the trade-off that they made was we're going to give them to the electric sector because people don't have a substitute. In oil, they do.
Question? Yes, sir. Right there. Right here, Tisha.
Thank you for coming today, and appreciate your presentation. I guess my question is this, and what we're doing is really using public policy to pick winners and losers. And I think you made a comment about Mr. Deming being an oil man, and maybe his views were a little altered because of that. And I guess on the flip side of that, and just for full disclosure and make sure I understand your full point of view, I guess you're a nuclear man in a way, which would benefit from this legislation. And if so, would you mind take just a couple of seconds to let us know what this legislation would do for your shareholders and your profits, and what you foresee to be your additional profits due to this legislation?
Sure.
Thank you.
We're not asking for allowances, and allowances are not being given to nuclear power plants. They're not part of the formula. So they don't emit anything, so they don't get anything. So the nuclear plants that we own that are in our regulated jurisdictions, the benefit of the fact that they don't emit any CO2 goes to our customers, 100% to our customers. That means that the overall cost of meeting the regulations is going to be less, the bill will be less, there's no profit on that. That's the customers. We do have a fleet of nuclear plants that are non-utility related in the Northeast. They get no allowances, but we're proposing to spin that off. That will not be part of Entergy, most likely by January of next year. So Entergy's profits are not changed. That will be a whole separate company. With regard to that company, of course, they are clean. They don't emit CO2. The price in the marketplace will change by the fact that most people do emit CO2, so the price will go up. So they will be more profitable than they otherwise would be because they're clean. But, you know, in all honesty, I can't stand up here and apologize for the fact that that fleet doesn't emit CO2 and hasn't emitted CO2 for 30 years. The benefit of those plants not emitting CO2 is passed around to everyone, because that means that the emission levels that the Congress sets don't have to be as low because we didn't put as much in the atmosphere because we do have nuclear plants in this country.
Yes, sir.
Terry Wallen with Heifer International. Thank you for coming and speaking to this very important topic. We're all being introduced to a whole new set of numbers and concepts and relationships, and I would like to refer to the next to last page on your handout, which we appreciate very much. Thank you. In much of the literature that I read, at least, it talks about the need to reduce our CO2 emissions to a level of about 350, and here the figure's 450. Can you speak to that a little bit and what your thinking is there?
We can't get there from here. That's the thinking. You know, we're already screaming past 350. Now, you know, that's not to say 350 can't be achieved sometime in the future. I mean, as you know, there are exciting things going on with bioengineering that might be able to take CO2 out of the environment. We don't talk a lot about those things because they are over the horizon stuff, and it is irresponsible to say, well, let's not do anything and let's bet on bioengineering being able to suck CO2 out of the environment, for lack of a better word, or have trick the oceans into storing more than they do today. That's just, you know, going to the casino at this point and placing a bet. You're right, and 350 was the number, still is the number that most people would say they're comfortable with. So when we talk about climate change, we're not talking, I may have misspoke at times, because we're not talking about eliminating the risk of catastrophe. What we're talking about is mitigating the risk, because we are already past that point of where there is some probability of it happening. Now, the further we go up, 6, 7, 8, 900, that probability looks a lot more like a certainty. But 350 is generally regarded as a safe number, a safer number. Certainly.
We have time for one more question. Mr. Nixon, wait a minute, wait for the microphone here, please.
A friendly face.
Wally Nixon with the Arkansas Public Service Commission and formerly with Entergy years ago. I have a question about what your views are on the future of energy efficiency. I know you mentioned it in terms of Entergy's commitment to it as a resource And also, can you address how you might envision a utility making a business and a profit out of helping its customers actually use less of your product and have lower bills?
Right.
Can that be done?
Right. Yeah, it's probably the most difficult question that I get from my board, I get from investors, and I get in Washington. In Washington, what I get is the next time you show up, come armed with what you're really up to. Because companies don't come in, boards don't send CEOs here to promote the public good. That's not how you make money. That's not how you keep your job. That's not why investors put money in your company. We don't believe that. The principles of basically of sustainability, I think Rebecca mentioned that we are, there's actually 2 American utilities that are in the World Index for Sustainability. We're the only one that's been in the World Index, Sustainability Index, every year for the last 5 years. It's usually just been us. And the other companies that are in it are foreign companies that by law are required to do certain things or are government owned, and they have a lot of money to spend on social type programs. In our case, though, we firmly believe that what makes everybody better off makes us better off. And even though in the short run you can't run that kind of analysis to prove it, when your customers, when you have a sustainable environment, I mean, in Louisiana we're losing 40 square miles a year. I mean, that's pretty obvious that if you're losing that kind of land, you don't have customers out there anymore. When your customers can pay their bills, when your economy can grow because they can pay their bills and get higher education, when they can get health coverage, they can get better health and protection than what they've had today, lead healthier lifestyles. That makes everybody better off. I mean, that's just, it's very difficult, I guess, for me to articulate that in a way that if you don't believe that, you're going to buy it. And, but in all of our hearts, we believe that. We've seen that. I mean, when I came to the company 11, 12 years ago, and you were there, it was a mess. It was a mess. And people didn't like us for a reason. And if you look at the sustainability of the business, it really wasn't there. And I think because of the things that we've done and the things that we've tried to do, we do have a much more sustainable business. And that's what that sustainability index looks at. It looks at your customer base. It looks at whether or not your product is sustainable, the price of it, from an environmental perspective or any other perspective, and long into the future.